Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, torture is against the law. So if one administration's officials authorize the use of torture, should they be prosecuted by their successors? We ask constitutional law and national security expert Professor Stephen Vladeck. Private sector union membership in the U.S. has dipped well below 10% of the workforce. Employers say that's because workers don't want unions. Unions counter it's because labor law is broken. And the fix, argues Julia Martinez Ortega, is passage of the Employee Free Choice Act. Porn, police spying, and employee rights were among the issues taken up in the recently completed legislative session in Annapolis. With us to review the session is our Coffee House colleague and Maryland State Senator Jamie Raskin. Also, a Bread for the World photo essay, poetry by Becker and DJ Renegade, and music by Swedish bluesman Robert Lighthouse. On the Coffee House.
Welcome to Courting Justice at the Coffee House. The Department of Justice recently released memos issued by its Office of Legal Counsel that authorize waterboarding and other controversial interrogation tactics used during the Bush administration. President Obama has stated that these tactics amount to torture and will no longer be used. Should the authors of these memos be prosecuted for authorizing violations of domestic and international law? Should the Justice Department pursue prosecutions when President Obama has expressed a desire to look forward rather than backwards? Here to shed light on these difficult issues is constitutional law professor and national security law expert Stephen Vladeck. Welcome, Steve, to the Coffee House.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks for having me.
So, the Obama administration authorized the release of a number of memos. Some of these memos had been the subject of Freedom of Information Act claims, and they said that the information was going to come out anyway. They released them. A lot of controversy around them. The memos had been authored by a number of high-level officials in the Justice Department, including now sitting federal judge Jay Bybee and others. And in essence, they appeared to basically authorize what the president and others have said actually is torture. Mm-hmm. Before we get into the legal ramifications of all of that, can you first tell us a little bit about exactly what were the tactics that were authorized by at least some of these memos?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a number of different tactics that we see in the memos. Probably the three that might help to provide some context, going from perhaps least offensive to most. One tactic is, slapping the prisoner's face. Which I think most people would think, might be indecorous, but is hardly torture. Mm-hmm. It escalates though pretty quickly. Another tactic is taking a prisoner by the neck and slamming him into a wall head first, repeatedly. And then I think the most documented, the most controversial method is waterboarding, when the prisoners are subjected to having water poured over their mouths with a cloth that just gets tighter and tighter to basically mimic suffocation.
Or drowning,
Or
perhaps.
drowning, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is, that each of these techniques sort of in escalation produces effects that are, that are torturous.
So the memos that were released did what? First of all, they were issued from the Office of Legal Counsel. Perhaps you should tell us, first of all, what is the Office of Legal Counsel? What's their role within the Justice Department?
Well, since 1789, the Justice Department has been responsible for issuing opinions that pass upon legal questions that matter to the executive branch, even before perhaps these cases get into court. And as time has gone on, the Office of Legal Counsel has been this special office created within the Justice Department to handle the opinion-making function. So the OLC, as it's called, issues opinions on questions of legal interpretation within the executive branch. And as relevant here, there are actually a series of opinions issued by the OLC between 2002 and 2005 authorizing various forms of interrogation methods by both the CIA and by the Department of Defense.
Mm-hmm. So were they asked by the CIA to provide these opinions? oh, did they provide them on their own?
I mean, presumably there was something that led to these opinions being drafted. I think part of what's interesting is we don't yet know exactly what chain of events transpired that led to these memos being drafted, and that may matter. So if the OLC was actually drafting these memos simply trying to get at what they saw as the best answer to the legal question presented, that might actually well insulate them from certain kinds of investigations. If in contrast, as I think a number of people suspect, the opinions were basically written as after the fact cover for methods that were already being exercised, that were already being deployed by the CIA and by the military, I think that changes the situation, because then OLC isn't so much an impartial adjudicator as it is sort of providing legal cover for conduct that really should not have been justified.
So what did these memos actually do? Did they authorize members of the CIA to actually perform these tactics on prisoners at Guantanamo and other places?
Not quite. I mean, what the memos do is the memos take these specific tactics and they resolve whether these tactics violate something called the anti-torture statute, which is a provision of federal law. It's in the Federal Criminal Code. It's actually put there in the 1990s when we implemented the UN Convention Against Torture. And the memos say that these methods do not actually violate the torture statute, which means that anyone who actually undertakes these methods would presumably not face criminal liability for whatever they did. Now, the memos had a caveat. I mean, the memos basically said, based on the facts you've provided us, we believe that what you are doing is not in violation of the torture statute.
Well, did the torture statute specifically deal with those tactics that you described and specifically say that they constitute torture and are illegal?
Not quite. I mean, the torture statute is not a sort of laundry list of illegal tactics. I think it's more a general prescription on governmental conduct that leads to the infliction of what the statute calls severe pain or suffering. And part of what's controversial about these memos is that in one of the memos, the OLC interpreted severe pain or suffering to mean pain that is basically the equivalent of major organ failure or death.
So slamming somebody's head against the wall repeatedly was interpreted as not major pain and suffering?
That's right, and waterboarding, because it actually does not leave any physical damage long term, was viewed by the memo's authors as not satisfying that definition. And I think that is what is so perplexing about these memos, because they seem to not even pass the laugh test when it comes to common sense.
Well, isn't it true that most legal scholars have come out saying that there's no way that, I mean, that basically the interpretation that they gave is definitely, as you say, wouldn't pass the laugh test, that it definitely were, the opinions were not valid at all, and that in fact those were violations of international law. Sure,
but I mean, separate from the legal scholars, the international, the Red Cross Committee, the International Committee for the Red Cross, which I think is an even more authoritative body than we, law professors, has come out and said quite explicitly there is no question that what happened to at least some of these detainees constituted torture. And there really is no more authoritative body on this question in the world than the Red Cross. So I think, whatever we legal scholars say, the fact that the Red Cross has said it is really what is so troubling and so worrying here.
Well, and certainly the President of the United States has said repeatedly that certainly that waterboarding and some of these other tactics do constitute torture, that they're no longer going to go on. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, said as much, even during his confirmation hearings. But the president has also said, at least with regard to the lower level individuals at the CIA, that he doesn't think that they should be punished or prosecuted because they were simply following orders, etc. He seems to leave it a little bit more open when it comes to higher level individuals, and there's been an outcry by a number of individuals that the authors of the memos from the Office of Legal Counsel be prosecuted or punished in some way. How would that take place? I mean, what are the arguments for going forward with the prosecution? I mean, if they violate those laws, exactly what would they be prosecuted for?
Well, I think the strongest argument that's out there is that if they actually knew what they were doing, which is to say, if the authors of the memos knew that they were actually justifying something that was illegal, then they actually could be charged as co-conspirators. And indeed, the anti-torture statute has its own conspiracy provision. So the notion would be that these officials were involved in a government conspiracy to commit acts of torture against some of the detainees. To be fair, that's a bit of a stretch based upon the record that we currently have, but I think part of what's important to realize is that the record is still not complete. We're still waiting, for example, for the report from the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility, which may shed a lot more light into the internal decision-making process and whether any of the OLC lawyers in particular really not just should have known better, but actually did know better.
So this investigation is going on within the Justice Department, which presumably will give us the answers to some of these questions. And once they come out, well, even if the answers do indicate that technically there should be a prosecution, are there reasons why these individuals shouldn't be prosecuted? What are the arguments against prosecution?
Well, there's always a danger when you talk about a new administration going after an old, that it just looks like victor's justice, right? That it's, a change in political power leading to, one party going after the other's foibles. And that if we set a precedent for that today, we could see that repeated every time governments turn over from here on out.
Well, but isn't that more the political argument? I mean,
Sure.
we're a nation of laws, right? And this country is known for punishment. Certainly we punish individuals in this country more than any other country in the world. Low-level drug dealers, I mean, we lock these people up for years. And yet here, these individuals at the highest level are committing these pretty atrocious crimes, if in fact the evidence shows that. How can there possibly be a justification for not prosecuting?
Well, I think we have to be careful to distinguish between whether they could be prosecuted and whether they should be. I mean, for as bad as these crimes seem to have been, we do have a tradition of absolute prosecutorial discretion in this country. There have been any number of cases where you or I probably both would have liked to see charges brought against defendants where they weren't. And so I think that's why it becomes a political question. The legal question really is whether you could prosecute any of these officials. The political question is whether you should.
Right. And it's interesting because, of course, the Attorney General would be the individual in charge of those prosecutions. He's the member of the executive branch. The president technically is his boss. And so that's kind of an interesting tension right there, isn't it? The former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, at least before Mukasey, fired all of these U.S. attorneys.
Sure.
He ended up resigning in shame. There was, some indication that he had been directed to do so by the president. So isn't the Attorney General supposed to be independent of the president? And yet, how does that work if he in fact works for the president?
Well, I think he has to do whatever he can to balance those competing tensions, because he does work for the president, but he also has an independent responsibility as the nation's chief law enforcement officer to uphold the Constitution. And we've seen this before. I mean, during the Nixon administration, the famous Saturday Night Massacre, where Nixon first fires Attorney General Elliot Richardson and then fires his deputy because they both refused to fire the special prosecutor who was looking into Nixon. Even in the Bush administration, it's becoming increasingly clear that John Ashcroft at various points actually stood up to the White House and would not go along with certain things they want to do, including details we now know about the warrantless wiretapping program. So, I think there really is, it does put the Attorney General in a tough position, but not an intractable one.
And we have those examples in history. And certainly so far, Attorney General Holder appears to be acting fairly independently. We only have a little bit of time left. I was wondering if you could address quickly, what are the other ways that, if in fact there aren't going to be prosecutions, are there other ways that these individuals can be held accountable for these acts?
I think there are probably three to talk about really quickly. I mean, the first is we could have a wider-ranging investigation that tries to create a record as opposed to trying to hold any of these individuals criminally liable. You could call the Truth Commission, it could just be a congressional investigation, but some body that has both the subpoena and contempt power that could actually call witnesses, take testimony under oath, and really get into the heart of what happened here. I think creating a record would be a good goal here in its own right. Another possibility is to pursue ethical charges, because these are all lawyers, and they have responsibilities to the law as well as to their bosses. And indeed, there's been some movement on that, where some of these lawyers have actually had ethical complaints filed against them in their state bars. I'm not particularly optimistic that those will get anywhere, but it's a possibility.
Certainly they haven't in the past when
Right.
they've been pursued.
And then the third possibility, one of the key players here is Jay Bybee, who, as you mentioned, is currently a sitting
There's
judge.
talk of impeaching him.
That's right, and I think the impeachment question is a serious possibility, especially if we believe that based on what we know now, we never would have confirmed him in 2003.
Be interesting to see.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor Vladeck, for those important insights on these issues. For more information about the torture memos, visit www.aclu.org. I'm Angela Davis, and this has been Courting Justice.
What's it like to be called out of your name your whole adult life? Have people think Speedy Gonzales, sombreros and siestas, christen you Mex? What do they know of Cape Verde or Kanja? They think your name carries the mark of Zorro. They never question why you can translate in Brazil. They don't know the difference between S and Z is more than the difference between A sharp and B flat. That just like there's more than one fingering for B flat, there can be more than one tongue in a black man's mouth. They don't know Martinez or the blues in Criollo, that we weave panu for kente, sing cola boy for work songs, crumble couscous for cornbread, pick cranberries instead of cotton. All they know is you carved up mutton leg with Basie and could quote note for note from Webster's Dictionary of Solos. But tonight, at the Newport Jazz Festival, you step out from Big Ben's shadow, rise for your solo with a coladera in the curve of your horn. Transforming into sweet daddy grace, you preach hard enough to be heard all the way home in Pawtucket. They say Jesus could walk on water, but only Paul Gonsalves could walk on sour mash. Now your head bobs like the schooner Ernestina in rough seas. For 6 whole minutes, choruses cloud the horizon as a hurricane boils from your saxophone's bell. After your thunderous sermon, silver applause showers. You look into the darkness, hear all the bravas saying, obrigado. They know a sax ain't nothing but a trapiche. Emotions nothing but raw cane. No, you pressed your lips on the reed, squeezing out fluid riffs to distill the rum of our sweet inebriation in the brass tuning of your tenor. Duke knew how to spell your name, knew the difference between S and Z. That's why he picked a passion flower for you. Why, 9 days after you broke down your horn for the last time, Ellington closed the cover of his piano forever.
Welcome to Worklife at the Coffee House. The Employee Free Choice Act, now pending before Congress, could make a huge difference in the lives of working Americans. Unions consider its enactment to be their highest priority, and the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups are opposing it intensely, some saying its passage would be a catastrophe. So, what is the bill about? I am very pleased to have as my guest Julie Martinez Ortega, who is the research director of American Rights at Work, one of the organizations that is leading the charge for passage of the Employee Free Choice Act. I should add that I've been a consultant to American Rights at Work. Julie, thank you for joining us in the coffee house today.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
Well, first, what is the Employee Free Choice Act? What does it do?
Well, the Employee Free Choice Act will help to restore the right of workers in the U.S. to organize trade unions and bargain collectively. It's an amendment to the National Labor Relations Act. It has three main components. The first is when workers are trying to organize unions, they would have a free, straightforward process that would be free of intimidation by their employers when they're deciding whether or not they want a union. Secondly, once they have formed those unions, it would create a process for getting to a first contract in a reasonable period of time. And if during that organizing or first contract bargaining, in either of those two stages, there were violations of their labor rights, the penalties imposed against employers for violating those rights would be increased to make a more meaningful remedy that would really deter violations and allow the process of workers choosing unions to move forward in a swift manner.
Okay, you say it amends the National Labor Relations Act. Now, that was enacted in the 30s. It's more than 70 years old. And that act says that that's what it's there for. For 70 years, that's the act that has been there to protect the right of workers to organize unions. Why do we have to change it now?
Well, unfortunately, that law has been eroded severely over the decades that have passed since then. And it's also the case that the workplace has changed. What workers feel they need from the workplace has changed over time. There are a lot of issues that workers really want to put on the table and be able to bargain with their employers, to bargain over those issues. And the act would really sort of update the law, create a free and fair process for workers to make the decision about whether they want unions in a way that really hasn't been happening of late.
So the advocates claim basically, while the law supposedly does that, it just hasn't been doing it. But why do unions think that it's, I mean, this is a big deal. I mean, the unions have made their highest priority, they're mobilized, they're spending millions, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure its enactment. They say it's the most important issue that they've been advocating for in decades, and that it's critical that this pass. Why is this so important to them?
Well, I mean, at the core of what unions are about in this country and around the world is really about promoting the right to organize into unions for workers and the right to bargain collectively. Those are just, central parts of any sort of free functioning democracy. And, in our own statutes that we've created, as you said, many, many years ago in the National Labor Relations Act, we have expressed as a country, the fact that we value those things. And it's critical that there be a meaningful component to that. It can't just be that we say these things on paper, that they sit there in the statute, and workers have to actually be able to exercise those rights and exercise them in a way that is free from coercion from their employers. And that's just not happening right now.
Well, if that's what it's about, and it's just workers being able to assert this right that has existed for so long and to make it a more meaningful right, why are employers taking the opposite position and not only opposing this, but opposing it so vociferously? I mean, there have been quotes that we've seen that passage would be a catastrophe, that it would have dire consequences. Why the intensity of this opposition?
Well, first I'd say that we have to sort of differentiate between those voices within the business community that are opposed to the bill and are very, very strongly opposed to it, as you've stated, from those that have actually seen, upon closer examination and through experience having unions in their workplaces, that in many ways a workforce that has unions can benefit the bottom line of a company. And so we have a number of examples, AT&T, Kaiser Permanente, a number of different very successful companies, Southwest Airlines, that have in fact embraced the fact that they have unions and are working in positive labor management partnerships with them, and are already, without there being a legal requirement to do so, already engaging in many of the practices that the Act would help to promote. And so it's really not the case. I think it's a real fallacy out there that the business community is entirely opposed to this. For those that are opposed, I mean, the Chamber of Commerce clearly has taken this on as a very important priority for them, as they've seen how critical it is for labor and how much labor really is going to get behind passing this bill. But there are many reasons I think that you could sort of guess why they're opposed, and I think ultimately it comes down to them having an issue with workers really having a voice in the workplace. And as I said before, we've already passed legislation, we've already made it a clear statement that as a country we do value the voice of workers in the workplace. And anybody who's studied workplace issues would know that when you have an involved, informed, committed workforce, you're going to have a better business model, and that leads to a stronger economy and a stronger middle class for those workers.
Well, let me suggest some of the arguments that are being made against this legislation. I guess the one that you hear most often is that it does away with the secret ballot, that now the way unions are formed is through this process of an election. A National Labor Relations Board conducts an election, and this legislation would abolish the right to have this secret ballot election, which is a fundamental democratic right. That's what you hear.
Right, that's what you hear. That's not what you would read if you actually looked at the text of the bill. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the bill, the Employee Free Choice Act, is an amendment to the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Act has extensive language in it regarding the election process, and there's plenty of case law interpreting what that means, how that's actually been practiced over the years. The bill does absolutely nothing to do away with that election system that has been in place for so long. All it does is allow the workers to decide, do they want to, by petition or by some other process, assert that they have a majority of support for forming a union, or do they have to, or will the employer be able to say, even if 100% of the workers in this workplace have expressed to me their interest in forming a union, I can still make them go back to square one and go through the process of an NLRB election. And the problem is that the NLRB election is not an election as you and I would commonly think about an election. It sadly fails to meet any of the basic standards of what is a free and fair election. I mean, we know that when we go abroad to look at whether another country is voting in a new president or whatever, has really used the right process so that we would validate the outcome of the election, we expect that there would be many other components beyond just a secret ballot. I mean, a secret ballot does not equal a free and fair election. And what you have happening right now in the NLRB elections is a series of problematic, very unfair, against the workers trying to form the union, rules in place that really, it's in some ways, it's very sad that we have to use the term election to describe what that process is.
But in any event, what you said is that that process could still proceed even after, but there's this other, but I want to ask another criticism we hear is that in these difficult economic times, when the economy is going through a severe recession and so forth, that we shouldn't be messing around with things like this, that this will hurt the recession, this will hurt the economy and lengthen the recession, and this is the wrong time to be considering a change in our labor laws.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is to just look at history and see that so many of the important pieces of social legislation, including the National Labor Relations Act, were in fact passed in the midst of the Great Depression. These were not seen as things that were somehow going to hold back the country from moving forward and getting out of the Depression. In fact, they were part of the solution. And I think of this piece of legislation in many ways as part of the stimulus package that we're trying to do. It's one component of many to really try to give workers some leverage and give workers back what they are overwhelmingly saying they need, and at this time more than ever.
Okay, well, let's talk about, is this going to really pass? Is it realistic? Now, we know, because people have said there's going to be a filibuster against this legislation, and that requires 60 votes to break a filibuster. And I know in the past, 30 years ago, there was similar legislation. They never could get to that 60 vote. Now this year, you had Senator Specter, who was a Republican, has now switched to being a Democrat, but he says he's still opposed to this legislation, and there have been some prominent Democrats who have expressed some reservation. So is this viable? I mean, are we going to get to 60? Are we just having this debate, or is this really going to move forward?
Well, I think we are going to see something move forward. I mean, the American people are calling for this to move forward. 73%, as recently as about a month ago in a national poll, said that they do support this legislation and the sort of principles upon which it rests, which is that we have a fair process for workers to choose whether they want unions, reasonable time frames for getting to first contracts, and meaningful penalties when employers violate the law. And these principles are things that a number of senators who might not right now be publicly out there supporting this act, or who are in fact, if anything, raising some questions out there, these are principles that a number of folks have already sort of agreed are things that need to be addressed. Senator Specter in particular has written at least one law review article I'm aware of. He was a sponsor of the bill in the last Congress, has already acknowledged very clearly, and continues to do so, that there are some real problems with the so-called election process. He's interested in making changes and addressing these issues, as are a number of other senators.
Okay, so it sounds like you believe that this is still viable and still might happen.
Oh yeah, I think it will definitely.
Thank you, Julie. I'm afraid our time is up. And thank you so much for your insights on the right to organize a union, which was enshrined into law almost 70 years ago, but has too often been honored in the breach. The Employee Free Choice Act, if enacted, would be the first major change in labor law since the Great Depression, and would signal anew the nation's commitment to the rights of working people to organize. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been Worklife.
In the Dreamtime, although a time without sleep, there being no work from which to rest. A tiny gorge, an abyss vast as a grass blade or a thorn, as if cut by fish or bird bone, first divided the world. A mighty trickle, light torrent, seeped through this fissure, rushed slowly between velvet banks blanketed by moss so fine, its filaments glowed translucent green, burning the raw color of spring. And there we were, dreaming, not sleeping, the first people, like ants scuttling under Mayflower, violet, squill. Engineers arranging earth grain by grain, our legs thin as whiskers, our arms antennae, as if we were blind. Perhaps we were. Most likely we were, but of course we didn't know it if we didn't know words for eyes, for sight. What we knew was color, the taste of color, the crisp, moist savor of blue, green's fresh bitterness, bright, spicy snap of red, and yellow, pale yellow, almost ivory or pearl. It coated our lips like cream. And sienna, taste of clay, would become crust of bread, the soft summer night air, chocolate. But this was the time before bread, before chocolate, before cranberry, unctuous, sour, when Dreamtime's larder stocked milk, bee juice, pulverized seeds, acorn cap baskets oozing vermilion fruit. We opened our mouths, our pink tongues wriggled like worms, the earth's food slithered down our purple throats, filled our bellies until we leaked, until we lay beached like overturned boats, hulls basking in the heat. And then we played, water our instrument, our toy. We drenched everything we touched, our green hose no bigger than a straw, we sprayed. No longer blind, we watched rainbows cascade in drops against the sky, let the rain's cold kiss claim us as kin. Then the songs came, line after line, we reeled them out of our throats, the notes teaching us their tune, our tongues tasting words awake, and how ripe, golden, we did sing.
Welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. Before Barack Obama was elected, and along with him a solid Democratic majority in both chambers of Congress, many progressives rested their hopes for change in state capitals. And while the public spotlight has turned back to Washington, much of the hard work of change continues in places like Sacramento, Denver, Boston, and Montpelier. In Annapolis, the General Assembly recently completed a busy session, and with us to discuss it is my Coffee House colleague and Maryland State Senator Jamie Raskin. Welcome back to the Coffee House.
Delighted to be here as always.
Well, it's a tough time financially for the nation, and it's a tough time for the Maryland budget as well, but there was a little bit of help from Washington this time around.
Well, a lot of help from the Obama administration. I can't even fathom what it would be like without the stimulus package coming in. I mean, we were able to keep level funding for education, most health programs, our environmental commitments, but without the federal stimulus package, we really would have been up the creek. And I think most states are in the same posture. So, we were deeply invested in Obama's victory for national and international reasons, but for state and local reasons too.
And there's been a real payoff in terms of the amount of money that's come into the state, and it's enabled the state to fund programs that otherwise might have been cut.
Yeah, I mean, all of our hopes for the Purple Line in the suburbs of Washington and Maryland depend on the stimulus package, and I think that's true for most big, mass transportation projects, and it's true for a lot of the environmental programs that we need.
Well, let's talk about some quick hits. These are areas that you probably shared a lot of the views of the governor and legislative agenda, like on the treatment of vulnerable workers in the state. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, essentially we've had this problem of misclassification of workers where employers will take someone who's essentially an employee who works for them 40 hours a week or more and describes them as an independent contractor and then says, okay, you're an independent contractor, so there's no health insurance, there's no vacation, we're not going to pay Social Security taxes for you, we're not going to pay workers' comp, we're not going to pay unemployment insurance, and obviously it's a rip-off of the workers, it's a rip-off of honest employers who are willing to pay all of the taxes, and it cheats the state out of hundreds of millions of dollars in tax money. And so the governor had an initiative that I was very strong in championing. In fact, I had a similar bill, and I ended up just supporting his to crack down on this kind of workplace fraud.
And then there was another bill regarding equal pay for women workers, is that right?
Yes, indeed. I introduced a bill, the Lilly-Ledbetter Act of 2009, which is the state counterpart to what Obama signed into law as his first law. And basically this statutorily overrules a terrible decision by the Supreme Court, a 5-4 decision where the court said, if you've been discriminated against for 25 or 30 years, and you learn about it right before you leave your job, which is what happened to Lilly-Ledbetter, a victorious suit that you bring before a jury of your peers is nullified because you didn't bring it within 180 days of the first discriminatory paycheck. And what this says is that
even if you didn't know about the discrimination.
If you didn't know about it, yeah. And so And Lily Ledbetter didn't know about it. She was about to retire and didn't know she'd been discriminated against on the basis of her sex for more than 2 decades. So what we say is that every new discriminatory paycheck resets the statute of limitations. And so if you didn't know about it, you're still okay. You can bring a lawsuit.
A continuing offense.
It is indeed. So that was a real victory, and we had also some disability rights legislation that got through. So we're definitely moving the ball forward in terms of civil rights and civil liberties too.
And domestic violence?
And domestic violence also. We increased the power of judges to remove firearms from domestic abusers when there's an injunction put in against them. So if there's a protective order in place, the judge, in some circumstances, has to remove firearms, and in other cases, may remove firearms.
And the General Assembly took some significant action on the question of climate change.
Yes, finally, we passed this Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act, which commits the state to reduce our current greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by the year 2020, and to institute a set of measures that will get us there. So we think that Maryland can be and really ought to be a national leader in terms of taking global warming seriously and dramatically reducing the amount of greenhouse gases that we produce.
There's been reform on the death penalty in the state, not exactly what you were aiming for, but an advancement, huh?
Well, but I'd introduced the bill for the Civil Ethics Commission, which ended up reporting a number of startling things, including the fact that we've executed 5 people in the last 3 decades, and all of their victims were white, and we have 5 people on death row right now. All their victims were white, and yet 2/3 of the victims of homicide in our state are not white, are African American or Hispanic. So that's not working well, and we also have a real problem with innocent people being prosecuted and convicted. And one whom actually served on the commission, Kirk Bloodsworth, was in prison for 8 years and was on death row for several years before DNA evidence exonerated him. And he was fortunate that DNA technology came along in time. Well, we moved to follow New Jersey in repealing the death penalty. The full Senate was not quite there yet, but we did make some dramatic progress, because what we ended up passing was a law which says the state cannot execute unless there is conclusive DNA evidence linking the convict to the crime, or a videotape confession. So at least we're dealing well with the problem of innocence. Some of the other things, like the racial disparities, the extraordinary expense, we'll have to come back to.
You were very involved on the question of police spying. There was a whole series of incidents during the Ehrlich administration, the predecessor administration, the O'Malley administration, spying on death penalty, anti-war, climate activists. What happened there?
Well, it wasn't just the infiltration and the espionage. It was also the creation of a list of alleged terrorists. I had a number of constituents who are environmental champions, like Mike Tidwell, peace activists, who were put on a terrorist watch list, essentially, and described by our state police as terrorists. One woman said, "Senator Raskin, if there's a bug on our kitchen floor, I put it on a paper towel and I walk it outside and put it in the backyard." And they called me a terrorist. I mean, there were Quakers and pacifists and Catholic nuns. So what we passed was, I think, the strongest civil liberties provision in the country, to say that there can be no spying on nonviolent political groups unless there's first an articulable statement signed by a chief of police or his or her designee saying that there's reasonable suspicion to believe that there's criminal activity going on. What was incredible about all of the spying that took place a few years ago was they would go into these meetings for several hours, they would write a report which concluded there's no reason to think that there's any crime or violence taking place here. We recommend that the investigation continue. And it would keep going and going. And so, in addition to the civil liberties invasion, it was a tremendous waste of our tax money.
Now, this was something that the governor slightly disagreed with you about, didn't he, in terms of his approach to how to solve this problem?
Originally, the governor said that we really should make the state police and other law enforcement units write regulations about this. And, my point was that's not the solution. That was the problem. They They wrote their own policies before. And look, this is something that all of the people of Maryland should be deeply invested in, which is the relationship between the state and the people. And I'm proud to say we had real bipartisan support on this. And there was some spying that went on against the anti-choice pro-life movement. So Republicans also saw the hand of Big Brother here, and we were able to get, I think, fairly almost unanimous bipartisan support to change the law. So I'm proud of what we did.
One of the hot button issues before the legislature this year was the question of driver's licenses for undocumented aliens. Tell me what happened there and what the issue was.
Well, remember, the Real ID Act passed by Congress required all of the states to adopt so-called lawful presence requirements. And if the states don't, then our people are not going to be allowed to use their driver's license to get into federal buildings or on an airplane. So it was sort of a Godfather offer that was extended to us by the federal government. And we were one of the last states to accept it. We were one of the last 4 states. But we did comply with the Real ID. We did adopt a lawful presence requirement. But there was sort of a division between the Senate and the House, and the politics were quite complicated. But essentially, the House position prevailed partially on one question, which is what about the large number of people? We don't know if it's 50,000, we don't know if it's 100,000, but what about the people who are here, who are undocumented now, who already have driver's licenses and are using their licenses to take their kids to school or to drive to work or whatever? And what we said was that no new people can get a license if they're not documented. They've got to have proof of citizenship or lawful presence. But as to people who already had a license, they're grandfathered in for one more renewal, and then it's all over on July 1, 2015. So it gives people at least some years who are already licensed in the state to figure out what to do.
We're down to the last minute or so. 2 more issues I want to get to. One is your championship of porn. And the second is...
That's a little overstated, yeah.
and the second is the status of civil marriage in Maryland.
Okay. Well, firstly, the Republicans went on a little bit of an anti-pornography moral crusade in the last week of the session, and they wanted to cut off all money to the University of Maryland, our Nobel Prize-winning physics department, economics department, English department, the women's basketball team, whatever, because there was one student group was going to show one dirty movie at midnight. And of course, it totally cuts against the First Amendment. If under our system, if you don't want to see a movie, you don't see a movie. So all they succeeded in doing was making this the most famous pornographic movie in America. And I said, if you go another week, you'll make it the most famous, the #1 movie in America, all told. So we were able to defeat that eventually. Now we're still pushing to give marriage rights to all of the people of Maryland. And it's, an incredible discrimination against thousands of my constituents, gay and lesbian people who don't have equal rights. There are hundreds of rights and benefits that are tied up with the institution of marriage, and we've got to make it available to everybody who lives in our state.
And finally, real quickly, what's the top of the agenda for next time?
Well, there are a number of things. One thing that's very much on my mind is there is a bill that we lost that we had no reason to lose, which would, it's a healthcare fraud act, which says that the state of Maryland can go after healthcare providers that are engaged in Medicare and Medicaid fraud and get treble damages against them. And it gives citizens the right to blow the whistle and an incentive to blow the whistle. Virginia did it, and they made, I think, more than $100 million in the first year of having such a healthcare fraud act. We've got to do that in Maryland. There's just no reason not to do it. There's a lot of waste and fraud and abuse out there, and these times are too tough to let that go. We need every dollar we can for the people of the state.
Many thanks to Senator Jamie Raskin. We knew when you went to Annapolis that you'd be an active innovator. You've surpassed all expectations. Good luck next year with the unfinished business. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Thank you, Mark.
Soul story junk food and MTV. So starving, they fed junk food and MTV. They say if you join the army, you can be all that you can be. A homeland stolen, built up by people stolen from theirs. Homeland stolen, built up by people stolen away from theirs. Witness the bush when you speak of axis of evil. You better think of your own homeland affairs. Weapons of mass destruction. The biggest risk is bad health and obesity. Weapons of mass destruction. The biggest risk is bad health and obesity. Well, Joe Sixpack, I hope you listen. Stay away from junk food and bad TV.
I'd like to welcome you to the musical tradition segment of the Coffee House.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What was that one called?
That one was called Homeland Security Blues.
It doesn't seem like you pulled that out of 1928 or something.
No.
That's one you wrote?
Yeah, just trying to I did write that a couple of days ago.
It's neat, though, how you fit it into that style, you know, that old style. I got to tell you that I guess we've known each other a long time, but I probably have never told you this story. I'd heard you on recording before we actually met, or I'd actually seen you. And I remember I was going to be out at the Washington Folk Festival with a booth out there, and you were going to be playing. I thought, oh, great, I'll get to meet you. And I was pretty sure I was going to be meeting about a 45-year-old black guy playing the blues. And I remember coming around the side of the Cuddle Up stage at Glen Echo, and I was like, wait a minute, this can't be. How did this happen? You're from
Sweden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I guess I really got into blues when I was about 15.
yeah.
I always liked music and
You were playing guitar before that,
yeah.
and then somebody.
Yeah, a friend of mine that he introduced me to like Muddy Waters and Johnny Winter, Hendrix, and then once I heard Hendrix, and I was pretty much gone.
Yeah.
For blues. Yeah.
And then from that time, when did you first come to America?
I was actually 18 first time I came here.
Yeah.
So and I was here for a couple of months, and I went back, and then I came here again in 1987.
And you've been here since then, really?
Yeah.
Making life as a pretty good blues singer.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you mix sort of Hendrix's vocal style with a pre-war playing style. I mean, that's you. That's nobody else is really doing that.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. You got another tune for us?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's take us home with that one.
All right.
make my baby cry. Don't leave her alone. Used to make her smile. She wanna love. One night. Found me when I was alone, and it took me into a house. Me and her used to have a home. She wanna love, one night love. We've been walking where the sun never go down. We've been driving through storms of snow and sand. I used to be a man a long time ago. She made beautiful things. Wrote a story about a turtle and a fish. Used to run around wearing wings. She wanna love one I love. Well, desire always on my mind. My eyes got so big, my heart went blind. It happened all the time. Oh my. But she got dark brown hair and a freckle on the nose. From her head down to her toes, she one I love, one I love.